You're listening to Audiology. Support this channel by becoming a member and be sure to submit your requests for topics in the comments below. The Jim Crow laws were a series of rules set up in the southern part of the United States after the Civil War, around the late 1800s through the early 20th century. These laws made it legal to separate people based on their race, especially targeting African Americans, who were disparagingly referred to as Jim Crow. This situation lasted until 1965. Although these segregation policies were most common in the South, other parts of the country also had their own versions of segregation, even as some northern states tried to fight discrimination in public spaces and in voting rights. During this time, Southern legislatures, dominated by white politicians known as Redeemers, passed laws that stripped African Americans of their political and economic achievements, gained during the Reconstruction period right after the Civil War. This effort to segregate and disenfranchise African Americans got support from what was known as the Lily White movement, a movement aiming to exclude African Americans from political power. Jim Crow laws required the separation of races in public places and were supported by a Supreme Court decision in 1896, Plessy v. Ferguson, which introduced the separate but equal doctrine. However, the reality was far from equal. African American schools, toilets, and other facilities were often in much worse condition than those for white people, if they even existed at all. Essentially, Jim Crow laws placed African Americans in a position of inferiority in nearly every aspect of life. The fight against these laws gained momentum when the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP, was founded in 1909. It took on these discriminatory laws through public protests and legal challenges. A major victory came in 1954 with the Supreme Court's decision in Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, which declared state-sponsored school segregation unconstitutional. However, changing these deeply ingrained laws and practices took years and significant effort, including further Supreme Court rulings and the passage of powerful new laws, like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which finally put an end to the Jim Crow era. The first time we see the term Jim Crow law being used goes back to 1884, found in a newspaper piece that was recapping a discussion in Congress. Then, in 1892, this phrase showed up again, this time in a New York Times article's title that talked about Louisiana's new rule for segregated train compartments. Now, where does this phrase Jim Crow come from? It's generally linked back to Jump Jim Crow, a song and a dance that mocked African Americans, performed by a white actor, Thomas D. Rice, with his face painted black, premiering in 1828. Because of how popular Rice and his act became by 1838, Jim Crow turned into a derogatory way to refer to black people. Fast forward to the late 19th century, the southern states passed a series of laws enforcing racial segregation aimed at African Americans. These laws got the name Jim Crow laws. In January 1865, Congress put forward an amendment to ban slavery in the United States, which became official as the 13th Amendment on December 18, 1865. From 1865 to 1877, during a period known as the Reconstruction era, new laws were introduced to protect the civil rights of African Americans in the South. These included newly freed former slaves and a smaller number who had been free even before the Civil War. However, by the 1870s, Southern Democrats were regaining control, and violent groups such as the Ku Klux Klan and others used intimidation, violence, and voter fraud to suppress African American votes and push Republican officials out of power. There was even a coup in North Carolina where Republican leaders were violently overthrown. This violent atmosphere and disputed elections, especially in places like Louisiana, led to mounting violence against African Americans. The Compromise of 1877, which was about pulling federal troops out of the South to settle a presidential election, led to the end of federal intervention in the South. This allowed white Democrats to take over every southern state government and enact Jim Crow laws that enforced racial segregation and oppressed African Americans. Despite these setbacks, African Americans continued to be elected to local offices in the 1880s, in areas with large black populations. However, their ability to vote in state and national elections was heavily suppressed. Southern states introduced laws making voting difficult, effectively disenfranchising most African Americans and many poor whites through poll taxes, literacy tests, and other restrictive measures. As a result, voter turnout plummeted. For example, in Louisiana, the number of black voters dropped from a majority to less than 0.5% of eligible black men by 1910. Similar disenfranchisements happened across the South, significantly diminishing the political and social influence of African Americans. Those affected by these voting restrictions also lost the right to serve on juries or run for office, essentially removing them from political life. And although public schools had been established for both black and white children during Reconstruction, the schools for black children suffered from severe underfunding, affecting their quality of education. In short, these discriminatory practices and laws had a lasting impact on African American communities, stifling their political representation, economic progress, and social status in the South. Public libraries for black Americans were often poorly funded and equipped mainly with secondhand books and resources, when they existed at all. It was not until the early 1900s that these libraries started to appear in the South. Throughout the period known as the Jim Crow era, access to libraries for African Americans was limited and inconsistent. Before the 20th century, most libraries serving African Americans were part of schools. The creation of many public libraries during this time for both black and white Americans was spearheaded by middle-class activists with support from the Carnegie Foundation. Interestingly, some laws that aimed to cut down on election fraud ended up making it harder for both black and white illiterate voters. The 8-box law in South Carolina is a prime example of this. During the Progressive era, between the 1890s and 1920s, segregation was legally imposed and became a widespread practice. This meant that even if Jim Crow laws did not explicitly ban African Americans from sports or leisure activities, the prevailing culture of segregation kept them separate anyway. The 1912 presidential election is a clear example of how the system was rigged against African Americans. Most black Americans lived in the South and were effectively denied the right to vote through tactics like poll taxes and literacy tests. These strategies were designed with loopholes that primarily white Americans could exploit, like the grandfather clause in Oklahoma, which exempted anyone whose ancestors could vote before 1866, essentially all European Americans, from literacy tests. Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat who was born and raised in the South, became president. Despite the integration of workplaces in Washington, D.C., and federal offices since the Civil War, Wilson and his Southern appointees pushed for segregated offices. In 1913, Treasury Secretary William Gibbs McAdoo, a Wilson appointee, voiced his discomfort with black and white women working together. Under Wilson, the federal government saw a reintroduction of segregation amidst objections from black leaders and progressive whites. Wilson, who held strong segregationist beliefs, thought segregation benefited both black and white Americans. His view starkly contrasted with critics and African American leaders of the time. At a 1913 event marking 50 years since Abraham Lincoln's historic statement on equality, Wilson celebrated the unity of America, overlooking the racial divisions still present. An editorial from the Washington Bee and remarks from historian David W. Blight highlighted that this event, under the guise of peace and unity, ignored the ongoing issues of racial segregation and white supremacy. In addition, several towns in Texas between 1910 and the 1920s adopted laws forcing black and white residents to live separately. This period also saw the emergence of laws mandating segregated public facilities, and the Republican Party's Lily White movement, which sought to exclude African Americans from political participation, gained momentum. The Civil Rights Act of 1875, championed by Charles Sumner and Benjamin F. Butler, promised equal access for everyone, no matter their race, color, or past servitude, to public facilities like inns, trains, theaters, and other leisure venues. However, this act did not make much of a difference in reality. By 1883, the Supreme Court declared parts of the act unconstitutional, arguing that Congress did not have the right to regulate the actions of private individuals or companies. With white Southern Democrats holding significant power in Congress partly because they maintained their representation, despite many being disenfranchised, it took until 1957 for another civil rights law to be passed. In 1887, Reverend W. H. Hurd took a stand against the Georgia Railroad Company for racially segregating passengers, a practice justified under the guise of providing separate but equal accommodations. This defense held up in court. Then came Louisiana's 1890 legislation, mandating separate railway cars for black and white passengers, further isolating colored individuals, or those of mixed heritage, who had previously been able to ride with white passengers. In response, residents of New Orleans across races formed a group aiming to overturn this law. They enlisted Homer Plessy, a man of mixed race, to challenge the segregation. When he deliberately sat in a whites-only car in 1892 and refused to move, his arrest triggered a legal battle that reached the Supreme Court. Unfortunately, in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, the court endorsed segregation through the separate but equal doctrine, cementing deep racial divisions for the next 58 years. However, a small victory occurred in 1908 when Congress blocked a proposal to segregate streetcars in the nation's capital, showing that the fight for equal rights continued even in the face of setbacks. After slavery ended, white Southerners found it challenging to adjust to managing labor without enslavement, and harbored resentment towards African Americans, whom they associated with the Confederacy's defeat in the Civil War. This led to a widespread effort among white people in the South to cling to their previous status by intimidating African Americans who were starting to exercise their newfound rights. Many white Southerners used their influence to enforce segregation in public places and in the law, aiming to regain their social dominance over black people. One argument made for excluding African Americans from public life in the South was supposedly for their own protection. An early 20th century academic argued that if black students were allowed in schools with white students, they would be constantly exposed to negative attitudes, which could foster an unhealthy obsession with racial issues. This argument assumed that anti-black bigotry was a given, considering the pervasive racism in post-slavery Southern society, which essentially evolved into a racial caste system. Support for white supremacy found backing in so-called scientific racism and harmful stereotypes of African Americans. This ideology supported social segregation in many aspects of life, from where people lived to laws that even barred interracial chess games. Such segregation was claimed to be necessary to prevent relationships between black men and white women, particularly driven by the fear-mongering stereotype of the predatory black buck. In 1944, Justice Frank Murphy used the term racism for the first time in a United States Supreme Court opinion during the case of Korematsu versus United States. He criticized the decision to uphold the forced relocation of Japanese Americans during World War II as a descent into the ugly abyss of racism. Interestingly, this wasn't the only time Murphy mentioned racism that day. He also used it in another case, Steele versus Louisville and Nashville Railway Company, and went on to use it in 5 of his opinions. However, after he stepped down, the word racism disappeared from Supreme Court opinions for 20 years, only to reappear in 1967 with the pivotal Loving versus Virginia case. During the 1930s and 1940s, the fight against segregation included numerous boycotts and protests. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People was at the forefront, legally challenging laws that denied black people the vote in the South. These early protests began to build momentum for greater political activism, especially after World War II. Black veterans who had fought for freedom abroad returned home with little patience for the oppression they faced. One notable example was K. Leroy Irvis from Pittsburgh's Urban League, who, in 1947, led a protest against job discrimination by department stores, kicking off his influential political career. The period after World War II marked a turning point as people of color increasingly demanded their rights as full citizens, fueled by their contributions to the war effort. The civil rights movement was spurred on by several critical events, such as the brutal attack on Isaac Woodard, a black World War II veteran, by police in 1946. In response to growing pressure, President Harry S. Truman ordered an end to racial discrimination in the military with Executive Order 9981 in 1948. That same year marked a milestone in education with Silas Herbert Hunt's enrollment at the University of Arkansas, signaling the beginning of the end for educational segregation in the South. As the civil rights movement advanced, leveraging federal courts to challenge segregation laws, Southern states' white-led governments sought new ways to maintain racial barriers, setting the stage for continued struggle and resistance. Historian William Chafe has delved into how African American communities developed ways to cope with the harshest aspects of Jim Crow laws. This included dealing with an unjust legal system, unequal economic opportunities, and the mental and emotional stress caused by intimidation. Chafe mentions that African Americans built a kind of protective socialization within their community. This was their strategy to navigate the rules set by white society, while also quietly laying the groundwork for challenging those rules. Chafe describes this balancing act as walking the tightrope, noting that these early efforts did not have a huge impact before the 1920s. Yet, these actions laid the groundwork for the racial equality and desegregation efforts that future generations would pursue more vigorously. According to Chafe, change had to start somewhere, and that somewhere was within key community institutions, especially black churches. These churches were vital for fostering community bonds and discussing political strategy. In addition, certain all-black towns like Mound Bayou in Mississippi and Ruthville in Virginia became beacons of pride and motivation for the African American community nationwide. As time went on, the resistance against unfair laws and regulations became more direct and bold, culminating in the robust activism of the 1950s civil rights movement. This period marked a significant turning point as more African Americans began openly fighting against racial oppression. The Legal Defense Committee of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which operates independently from the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, led by their lawyer Thurgood Marshall, took the historic case, Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, to the U.S. Supreme Court when Earl Warren was Chief Justice. This was back in 1954. The court, under Chief Justice Warren, reached a unanimous decision, 9-0, that changed the course of history. They reversed the ruling from the 1896 case Plessy v. Ferguson, declaring that the segregation in public schools based on laws, also known as de jure segregation, violated the Constitution. This decision was groundbreaking and had wide-reaching effects on society. In the 1950s and 60s, the southern United States was facing a crucial moment, as racial integration of all-white college sports teams became a key topic. This was about more than just sports. It was about equality, overcoming racism, and the desire among alumni to recruit top talent to win big games. Leading this change was the Atlantic Coast Conference, which represents flagship state universities in the Southeast. They began by scheduling games with integrated teams from the North. Eventually, due to pressure from supporters and civil rights advocates, Atlantic Coast Conference schools began to integrate their teams as well. These schools were influential, with an alumni network deeply embedded in local and state politics, society, and business. Their successful integration efforts are a testament to their influence. Pamela Grundy highlights an important point about this era. The respect and admiration for athletic skill played a key role in pushing for social change. Athletic fields became arenas where societal assumptions about worthiness and participation were openly challenged. Even though athletic achievements alone couldn't eliminate prejudice or stereotypes, with black athletes often facing racial slurs, their success on the field demonstrated their discipline, intelligence, and grace. This not only challenged existing stereotypes but also showed that minority athletes were more than capable of leading and influencing across all areas of national life. In 1955, in Montgomery, Alabama, Rosa Parks famously refused to surrender her bus seat to a white passenger. This wasn't the first instance of such resistance. Rosa was actually inspired by a young 15-year-old, Claudette Colvin, who did the same thing 9 months before. However, it was Rosa Parks' act of defiance that became a symbol for the growing civil rights movement after 1954. Her actions sparked the Montgomery bus boycott, a pivotal event that lasted for over a year, and eventually led to the buses in the city being desegregated. This event, among others, fueled by both protests and legal battles, played a key role in breaking down the Jim Crow laws that enforced racial segregation. The end of segregation was ushered in through decisive actions taken by Congress, which saw lawmakers from both parties join forces to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, despite strong resistance from the South. This period, from 1954 to 1965, was marked by a series of unexpected factors aligning to pave the way for significant changes. The Supreme Court kick-started this era with its landmark decision in Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, declaring that segregating public schools was unconstitutional. While the North and border states quickly complied, The South dug in its heels through a campaign known as massive resistance, led by rural segregationists who dominated state legislatures. Efforts by Southern liberals for moderation were largely overwhelmed by louder voices from both ends of the spectrum. The civil rights movement, particularly driven by Martin Luther King Jr.'s Southern Christian Leadership Conference, emerged as a more dynamic force than the more moderate National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, leading the charge with significant media-grabbing protests. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, along with student activists and local groups, staged protests across the South, drawing national attention to cities like Birmingham, Alabama. There, the choice to use young teenagers as demonstrators met with a harsh response from police under the leadership of Bull Connor, who used extreme measures like billy clubs, police dogs, and high-pressure water hoses. This brutality, broadcast nationwide, shocked Americans and pressured businesses and political leaders in the South to seek a change. Key moments included Governor George Wallace's standoff at the University of Alabama, refusing to desegregate in direct defiance of court orders, and Martin Luther King's massive March on Washington in August 1963. These events, among others, pushed President John F. Kennedy to propose comprehensive civil rights legislation. Following Kennedy's assassination, President Lyndon B. Johnson took up the mantle, pushing for the passage of civil rights legislation to honor Kennedy. Johnson's successful efforts, alongside support from Northern Republicans and key figures like Senate Leader Everett Dirksen, led to the breaking of the Southern filibuster and the historic passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This act was monumental in its scope, mandating desegregation in public places, empowering the Justice Department, and setting a precedent against discrimination based on race, religion, and gender. Despite initial resistance, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 quickly took hold across America, after being signed into law by President Johnson on July 2, 1964, with only minimal opposition remaining, exemplified by individuals like Georgia restaurant owner Lester Maddox. In January 1964, President Lyndon Johnson had a significant meeting with civil rights leaders. During his first State of the Union address on January 8th, President Johnson made a powerful request to Congress. He urged them to make this Congress session the most impactful for civil rights compared to the combined efforts of the last 100 sessions. Later that year, on June 21st, a grave incident occurred. 3 civil rights workers named Michael Schwerner, Andrew Goodman, and James Chaney went missing in Neshoba County, Mississippi. They were there to help register African American voters as a part of the Freedom Summer Project. The disappearance of these activists shocked the nation, sparking widespread outrage. President Johnson and civil rights activists used this moment to rally support, bringing together Democrats and Republicans from the North and the West. This coalition was instrumental in the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. On July 2, 1964, President Johnson signed the monumental Civil Rights Act into law. This act, by invoking the Commerce Clause, made it illegal to discriminate in public spaces like restaurants, hotels, stores, private schools, and workplaces. The Supreme Court supported this use of the Commerce Clause in the significant case of Heart of Atlanta Motel versus United States. By 1965, there had been ongoing efforts to dismantle state-imposed barriers to voting, especially in the South. However, progress was slow, and in parts of the Deep South, white resistance rendered these efforts nearly futile. The murder of Schwerner, Goodman, and Chaney, the refusal of Mississippi to prosecute their killers, and other acts of violence and terrorism against black individuals drew national scrutiny. The situation reached a tipping point on March 7, 1965, when Alabama troopers violently attacked peaceful marchers on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, as they were marching from Selma to Montgomery. This brutality motivated President Johnson and Congress to push past the opposition from Southern lawmakers and craft legislation to ensure effective enforcement of voting rights. This effort culminated in the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which demolished legal barriers at the state and local levels that prevented citizens from voting. The act also set up federal oversight in areas with a history of low minority turnout. Despite these advancements, ongoing efforts and legal battles were necessary to safeguard voters' rights and ensure they could elect candidates who represented their interests. Some areas tried to weaken minority voting power by changing how council members were elected, often diluting minority votes. In a significant setback, The 2013 Supreme Court decision in Shelby County versus Holder lifted the requirement for Southern states to get federal approval for voting policy changes, leading several states to immediately enact laws that restricted voting access. During the first half of the 20th century, the oppressive Jim Crow laws and a high number of lynchings in the South prompted the Great Migration. This was a time when African Americans, seeking better opportunities, moved in large numbers from the South to cities in the Northeast, Midwest, and West. Amidst the Jim Crow era, African American athletes faced significant discrimination, often being excluded from most organized sports competitions due to white opposition. Despite these barriers, some African American athletes rose to prominence. Boxers Jack Johnson and Joe Louis each made a name for themselves as world heavyweight boxing champions. Jesse Owens stunned the world by winning 4 gold medals at the 1936 Summer Olympics in Berlin. Meanwhile, in baseball, the color line drawn in the 1880s kept black players out of the major leagues, leading to the formation of the Negro Leagues. These leagues became the stage for many talented players. A pivotal moment came in 1947, when Jackie Robinson was signed to Major League Baseball, breaking the color barrier that had long excluded African Americans. Following Robinson's trail-blazing entry, baseball teams gradually integrated, culminating in the complete participation of black players in the major leagues by the 1960s. While anti-miscegenation laws, which prevented marriage between people of different races, are often associated with the Southern Jim Crow laws, it is important to note that such statutes were enacted in other states as well. These laws were not eliminated by the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Instead, they were struck down as unconstitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court in the landmark case Loving v. Virginia in 1967. In this unanimous decision, Chief Justice Earl Warren highlighted a fundamental right, stating, "The freedom to marry or not marry a person of another race resides with the individual and cannot be infringed by the state." Under the Sixth Amendment of the United States Constitution, when someone is charged with a crime, they're entitled to have their case decided by a jury of their peers. Now, for a long time, if you were dealing with federal crimes, the rule was clear. The jury's decision to convict had to be unanimous. But when it came to the states, things were a bit different. They could set their own rules. Almost all states agreed with the federal approach, requiring unanimity for a conviction. However, Oregon and Louisiana were the exceptions to this rule. They allowed a criminal conviction to be decided by a jury vote of at least 10-2. Things started to change recently, particularly in Louisiana. In 2018, they passed a law saying from 2019 onward, you need a unanimous jury to convict someone of a crime. This was a big deal because the old rule was seen as a leftover from the Jim Crow era, a way to weaken the voices of minority jurors. Then in 2020, the Supreme Court stepped in with a case called Ramos v. Louisiana. They ruled that actually, states need to have unanimous jury votes to convict someone of a crime too. This decision didn't just change things moving forward, it also knocked out Oregon's law, the last holdout, making unanimous verdicts the standard across the board. It was a significant moment, especially for those looking at the justice system's fairness and how laws from the past were still influencing it today. Back in 1971, the U.S. Supreme Court, at that time known as the Burger Court, made a significant decision in the case of Swan versus Charlotte-Mecklenburg Board of Education. They supported the use of busing, which is the practice of transporting students to different schools to promote racial integration. This was a big step in the ongoing effort to desegregate schools. How the Constitution is understood and applied, especially when it comes to the rights of minority groups, remains a hot-button issue. This debate evolves as new justices join the Supreme Court. According to expert Ian F. Lopez, there's a noticeable trend in the 2000s where the Supreme Court appears to lean towards maintaining the status quo. Mississippi today shines a light on the ongoing effects of Jim Crow, particularly focusing on how felony disenfranchisement remains an issue today, untouched by the progress made during the civil rights movement of the 1960s. They explained that a section of Mississippi's 1890 Constitution is still in effect. This section permanently strips away the voting rights of individuals convicted of certain crimes, such as theft and bribery. The framers of the 1890 Constitution believed these crimes would be predominantly committed by black individuals, illustrating a clear intention behind this disenfranchisement. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more content.